My father always told me I'd amount to nothing, right up until the day his accountant called him in a panic about the property taxes on his beach house. The house I'd quietly purchased 3 years ago through an LLC, he never bothered to research. No warning, no explanation. Just his voice cracking over speakerphone while his lawyer frantically flipped through documents that had my signature on every page. I didn't gloat, I didn't lecture. I simply let the silence do what years of my words never could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But to understand how a daughter becomes her father's landlord, you need to know what happened that December morning at the airport. One canceled ticket, one cruel text message, and the moment I read those words, everything in my family shifted forever. Before we continue, I want you to know that if you've ever been the one your family underestimated, the one they dismissed while you built something extraordinary in the shadows, this story is for you. Share your experience in the comments because none of us should feel alone in this. If you'd met me 2 years ago at any family gathering, you might have assumed I was the beloved daughter of a successful real estate developer. People often complimented my father on having such a well-mannered, gracious child. I never corrected their assumptions. It seemed easier than explaining that my father measured my worth in quarterly earnings reports and found me perpetually disappointing. Easier than describing how my stepmother treated me like an intern in my own childhood home, while my half-brother Cameron received standing ovations for mediocre achievements. Growing up in Charlotte, North Carolina, I learned early that love in the Harrison family was a performance-based compensation system. My father, Richard Harrison, built his commercial real estate empire through calculated decisions and cold negotiations. He applied the same principles to parenting. My stepmother Monica entered our lives when I was 8 years old, 6 months after my mother's death from breast cancer. She brought Cameron, her golden child from a previous marriage, and immediately set about establishing a hierarchy where I occupied the bottom rung. Cameron got the master bedroom on the second floor with the bay windows overlooking the garden. I got the converted attic space that baked in summer and froze in winter. Cameron's hockey trophies lined the main hallway in custom-lit display cases. My academic awards went in a drawer because Monica said wall displays looked cluttered. When Cameron crashed his third car before turning 20, my father bought him a fourth. When I asked to borrow a car to get to my university internship, my father suggested I learn the bus schedule and develop character through public transportation. By the time I graduated with dual degrees in finance and real estate development, I'd already been cut out of family vacations 3 times, uninvited from Cameron's engagement party because Monica needed my room for her sister, and informed that my presence at Christmas dinner was optional since they were keeping the gathering small. Small meant 12 people. I was number 13, the unlucky addition nobody wanted but everyone expected to accept the exclusion gracefully. But surviving that treatment taught me something my father never intended. If I wanted security, if I wanted respect, if I wanted a place at any table, I would have to build the table myself. So I did, methodically and quietly. I worked brutal hours at a commercial real estate investment firm, took every assignment my colleagues avoided, learned property law at night while eating vending machine dinners, and saved every dollar I didn't absolutely need to spend. I studied my father's business model, identified his weaknesses, and learned to see opportunities he overlooked because his ego convinced him he'd already mastered the market. 3 years after graduation, I moved into a modest townhouse in South End. It wasn't glamorous by my family's standards, but the mortgage was mine, the walls were mine, and nobody could tell me I was taking up space that belonged to someone more deserving. My daughter Emma, who was 4 years old at the time, finally had a bedroom where she could paint the walls purple and stick glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling without someone criticizing her choices. Emma's father had departed during my pregnancy when he realized that supporting a child would interfere with his lifestyle plans, leaving me to build stability alone. My father never understood that my distance from the family wasn't rebellion or sensitivity. It was survival. Even after I became a successful commercial property investor, even after I renovated distressed properties and built a portfolio that generated steady income, he still introduced me at business functions as his daughter who worked in real estate, emphasis on worked, as though I was someday hoping to graduate to his level of ownership. Cameron remained the heir apparent, the son who would someday inherit the Harrison legacy, despite having contributed nothing more than his presence to the family business. Monica made sure I understood my position during every interaction. She'd ask about my townhouse with a sympathetic tone suggesting I was making do with inadequate space, then pivot to describing Cameron's new construction home with the chef's kitchen and the infinity pool. She'd inquire about Emma with barely concealed judgment about my single mother status, then segue into detailed accounts of Cameron's perfect marriage to a woman whose family owned a textile manufacturing company. Every conversation was a carefully orchestrated reminder that I occupied a lower tier in the family ecosystem. So when I saved enough for a short vacation, a 4-day trip to see the Christmas lights in Asheville with Emma, I didn't announce it to anyone. I didn't mention it during the strained monthly dinners where I was expected to appear and admire Cameron's latest acquisition or business deal. I just wanted a few quiet days where my daughter could experience holiday magic, without the undercurrent of judgment and criticism that characterized every family gathering. I wanted to build Christmas memories that weren't tainted by someone's dismissive comment about my choices or circumstances. But secrets never survive long in families where some members believe they have rights to information about everyone else's lives, while revealing nothing about their own. The moment my father discovered I'd planned a trip without consulting the family calendar, without checking whether my absence might inconvenience anyone who might theoretically need something from me, everything started unraveling. Though calling it unraveling suggests it wasn't exactly what I'd been unconsciously preparing for during years of careful documentation and strategic financial planning. The morning of my trip felt deceptively calm, the kind of winter morning where frost patterns on windows look like intricate lace and your breath makes clouds in the air. I left the townhouse early while the neighborhood still slept, kissed Emma goodbye as she clutched her stuffed reindeer, and promised we'd be drinking hot chocolate and looking at lights by evening.
She got from where my neighbors are held her, and I allowed myself to believe that maybe this once, the universe would let me have something simple and good without my family finding a way to poison it. Charlotte Douglas International Airport was its usual December chaos of delayed flights, crying children, and travelers wrestling oversized luggage wrapped in holiday patterns. I blended into the crowd in my jeans and sweater, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, nothing about my appearance suggesting anything unusual. Nothing indicating that within minutes, the foundational understanding I held about my family would shatter so completely that I'd never be able to reconstruct it into anything resembling affection. When I reached the check-in counter for my 9:30 de la mañana flight, I handed over my driver's license and confirmation number while mentally reviewing the itinerary I'd planned for Emma. The agent scanned my information, paused, and scanned again. Her expression shifted from professional neutrality to uncomfortable confusion. "Let me just verify something," she said, her fingers moving faster across her keyboard. "There appears to be an issue with your reservation." My stomach tightened with the particular anxiety that comes from knowing something is wrong but not yet understanding what. "What kind of issue?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level despite the alarm bells beginning to ring in my consciousness. She angled her screen slightly toward me, though the text was too small for me to read clearly. "Your ticket shows as cancelled," she said carefully. "The refund was processed approximately 90 minutes ago." The word cancelled hit me like a physical blow. "That's impossible," I said, hearing my voice come out eager and thinner than intended. "I didn't cancel anything. Nobody has access to my account." The agent's discomfort deepened as she checked additional details. "The refund was issued to a card ending in 7742, she said, and I felt the floor tilt beneath me because I knew exactly whose card ended with those numbers. My father's business credit card. The card had given me access to years ago for family emergency purposes, access I'd never used but I'd never thought to remove from my travel account because I never imagined I'd use it against me. "Thank you," I managed to say, though I'm not sure what I was thanking her for. I stepped away from the counter on legs that felt disconnected from my body, other travelers flowing around me like water around a stone while I stood completely still trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed in my bag. Then again. Then a third time in rapid succession. I pulled it out with hands that had started trembling, and the screen lit up with messages that would permanently alter my understanding of what my father was capable of. The first text was from Dave. "Hope you enjoy walking back from the airport. Maybe it'll teach you about making plans without family approval. The second came 30 seconds later. Loser daughters don't get vacation trips. Get a real job and maybe you can afford your own tickets. The third message was from Monica. This is what happens when you think you're too good for family obligations. Sold a baby unavailable when Cameron needed help with his open house. He stared at the screen until the words blurred together into meaningless shapes. Travelers continued moving around me, dragging suitcases and chasing children and checking departure boards while my world contracted into 3 text messages that proved everything I'd tried not to believe about my family. It wasn't the cancelled ticket. It wasn't even the insult, though loser cut deeper than my father probably realized. It was the casual cruelty, the comfortable malice, the tone that suggested this was amusing to them. They didn't use disrespect me. They enjoyed disrespecting me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I walked toward the exit on autopilot, my mind struggling to process the intention behind what had just happened. They'd accessed my private travel information, cancelled a trip I'd saved for and planned, stole money from my account through a refund I didn't owe, and sent messages designed to humiliate me. Not because I'd done anything to them, but because I'd dared to make plans that didn't revolve around their needs and their schedule. Because I'd committed the unforgivable sin of living as though I had the same right to joy and rest that they claimed for themselves. The December outside the terminal was sharp and cold, cutting through my sweater and clearing some of the shock fog from my mind. I stood on the curb trying to decide what to do next. Call Sarah and tell her I was coming back to get Emma cancel the hotel reservation in Asheville. Go home to my townhouse and explain to my 4-year-old daughter why we weren't going to see the Christmas lights after all. Pretend this was a minor inconvenience rather than a calculated act of sabotage designed to remind me of my place. A red vehicle pulled up before I'd finished opening the app on my phone. The driver, a woman probably in her 50s with skinned eyes and silver-streaked hair, leaned out the window. You look like you just got hit by a truck, she said bluntly. You need a ride somewhere that isn't here? I hesitated only a moment before sliding into the back seat, suddenly desperate to be anywhere other than the airport where my father had just stolen my Christmas vacation. The driver introduced herself as Patricia and didn't press when he initially stayed silent. She just drove, giving me space to breathe while Charlotte's December landscape passed outside the windows. Eventually, the quiet became a container I could pour words into, and I found myself telling her everything. The cancelled ticket, the texts, the years of being treated like a disappointing investment that never generated adequate returns. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When I finally fell silent, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. You know what's interesting about people who use money as a weapon, she said, her eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. They always assume nobody else understands how money works. They think control of a credit card equals control of a person. Usually they're wrong about that, but they don't realize it until the bill comes due. Her words settled into my chest like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that spread outward into implications I wasn't quite ready to examine. I pulled out my phone again, but this time I didn't open the messages from my father and Monica. Instead, I opened a password-protected folder I'd created 2 years ago and labeled simply documentation. Inside that folder were files most daughters would never think to compile about their own families. Property records showing my ownership of assets my father assumed belonged to his friends or business associates. Spreadsheets tracking every time my family had borrowed money from me with vague promises to repay it later, money I'd never mentioned again because I knew asking would be characterized as petty and money grubbing. Saved text messages and emails spanning 5 years, each one demonstrating the pattern of dismissal, exploitation, and casual cruelty that characterized every interaction. Photographs of family gatherings were either been excluded, posted publicly on social media where he called see exactly what Ide been cut out of voice recordings from the last 3 times Ide visited their house, captured because Ide learned to keep my phone recording in my bag after too many instances where they the latter claimed Ide misheard or misunderstood comments that were actually quite supportive. Ide told myself he was keeping this documentation for my own sanity, to remind myself that he wasn't being overly sensitive or imagining the hostility that others insisted he must be misinterpreting. But sitting in Patricia's car while Christmas music played faintly from the radio, he recognized that some part of me had been preparing for exactly this moment. The moment when accommodation became impossible and action became necessary. He opened another folder, this one labeled Business Records. Inside were documents my father had no idea existed. Property deeds. Trust formations. Operating agreements. Articles of incorporation. 3 years ago, when Ide first started succeeding in commercial real estate investment, Ide formed an LLC called Magnolia Holdings. The name was deliberately generic, suggesting nothing about ownership or purpose. Through Magnolia Holdings, Ide acquired several properties including a beachfront vacation house in Wilmington that my father used regularly, a commercial building that housed one of his smaller offices, and a storage facility where he kept equipment and records. He rented all of these properties from Magnolia Holdings at rates his accountant had negotiated, never bothering to investigate who actually owned the company because he assumed any serious real estate entity must be owned by someone in his network. Ed literally been paying me rent for 3 years without knowing it, the checks processed through his business office and deposited into Magnolia Holdings accounts before being distributed according to the LLC's operating agreement. His signature was on every lease, every renewal, every insurance document. The beach house alone generated $3,200 monthly in rent that my father paid while simultaneously telling me he needed to develop better business acumen. The commercial building brought in another $4,500. The storage facility was technically month-to-month, renewable at either party's discretion. Ide structured everything carefully, with legal review, proper documentation, and strict adherence to landlord-tenant law. Not because Ide planned to use it against him, but because Ide learned to build things properly regardless of who might eventually benefit. Patricia pulled up outside a coffee shop in Plaza Midwood. You look like you need somewhere to sit and think, she said. This place makes excellent coffee and they don't rush people. Whatever you're deciding right now, make sure it's what you actually want, not what you think you're supposed to want. He thanked her, paid the fare, and sat at a corner table with a coffee he barely tasted. The folder labeled documentation was still open on my phone, years of evidence arranged chronologically. He scrolled slowly, remembering the context of each sad interaction. My father telling me that real estate investment wasn't appropriate for women who should focus on more stable careers. Monica informing me that he was setting a bad example for Emma by not having a husband. Cameron borrowing $8,000 for a business venture that failed within 6 months, money he never mentioned repaying because he recharacterized it as family support that he should have been honored to provide. The most recent addition to the folder was from 3 days ago. Ide installed a small audio recorder in my bag before going to my father's house to drop off Emma's Christmas gift for Cameron's daughter. He intended to record anything specific. Ide just learned that he couldn't trust my own memory against their later revisions of what was said and he needed evidence for my own sanity. But what Ide captured changed everything. He pressed play on the audio file, listening through my headphones to voices he knew as well as my own. The recording began with casual conversation, my father asking Monica about holiday plans. Then Cameron's voice joined, complaining about having to help with some family obligation. The conversation meandered until my name came up. Did you cancel her flight? Monica asked, her tone suggesting she was confirming unexpected action rather than discovering a surprise. My father's laugh came through clearly. This morning, he said. She needs to learn that planning trips without checking with family isn't acceptable. Let her figure out her own transportation. Maybe she'll develop some gratitude for the access we've given her. Cameron's voice joined in. She always thinks better than us with her little properties and her investor meetings. Monica made a dismissive sound. Please, she said. She's 1 bad month away from losing that townhouse. We should probably cut her off completely before she starts asking us for money. They all laughed, the sound casual and comfortable, 3 people enjoying their superiority over someone they'd already dismissed as inconsequential. The recording continued for another 12 minutes, but he stopped it. I'd heard what I needed to hear. They hadn't cancelled my flight in a moment of anger or as a response to any specific transgression. They'd done it because they could, because they wanted to remind me of their power, because my independence irritated them and they'd found a way to punish me for it. The cruelty wasn't a mistake or an overreaction. It was deliberate, calculated, and enjoyable for them. I sat in that coffee shop while winter sunlight streamed through the windows and Christmas decorations glittered on the walls. Other customers came and went, ordering specialty drinks and discussing holiday plans and shopping lists and all the ordinary concerns of people whose families didn't actively sabotage them. And I made a decision that had probably been forming since the moment I'd first learned to protect myself by documenting everything. I opened my laptop and began drafting 3 notices. 1 for the beach house, 1 for the commercial building, and 1 for the storage facility. Each notice informed the tenant of lease violations including unauthorized alterations to property and consistent late payments that had been previously overlooked, and provided formal notification that the leases would not be renewed beyond their current terms. Each notice gave the legally required 60 days for vacation of the premises. Each notice was signed by me in my capacity as managing member of Magnolia Holdings LLC. My hands didn't shake as I typed. I cross-referenced every claim against documentation I carefully maintained, making sure each violation cited was factually accurate and legally relevant. I attached copies of relevant lease clauses, payment records showing the pattern of late payments that had accrued fees I'd never noticed, and photographs documenting the unauthorized modifications I'd made to properties I didn't own. Everything was professional, legally sound, and absolutely devastating to the life I'd built while dismissing me as inconsequential. By the time I finished drafting the notices, the winter sun had shifted and the coffee shop had filled with afternoon customers. I saved all 3 documents, scheduled them for delivery to my father's business address and his accountant simultaneously, and closed my laptop. Then I opened my text messages and typed a response to my father's cruel note from that morning. I sent only 1 line, received your message. We talked on about respect and consequences. Then I blocked his number, blocked Monica's number, and blocked Cameron's number. I sat back in my chair and took the first deep breath that hadn't felt constricted since I'd stood at that airline encounter. For years, I'd protected my family from the consequences of their treatment by absorbing their cruelty and pretending it was normal. For years, I'd made myself small so they could feel large, accepted scraps so they could enjoy feasts, and smiled through dismissal so they never had to acknowledge their own cruelty. But that morning at the airport, my father had made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed my silence meant acceptance. He'd confused my restraint for an ability to respond. He'd mistaken patience for powerlessness. And in doing so, he'd freed me from any remaining obligation to protect him from understanding exactly who his loser daughter had become while he wasn't paying attention. I gathered my things and left the coffee shop as Christmas music played and people hurried past carrying wrapped packages and wearing smiles. I had a daughter to pick up, a Christmas to salvage, and a family to teach about what happens when you underestimate someone because you've never bothered to actually see them. The game had changed. They just didn't know it yet. The drive back to my townhouse took me through neighborhoods transformed by Christmas decorations, lights strung across porches and inflatable snowmen standing guard in yards where real snow never fell. I'd called Sarah from the coffee shop to let her know I was coming back earlier than expected, keeping my explanation vague enough that she didn't press for details. Emma would be disappointed about the cancelled trip, but at 4 years old she was resilient in ways I was still learning to emulate. We'd find another way to see Christmas lights, I promised myself. This time without the shadow of family sabotage darkening the experience. Sarah met me at her door with Emma already bundled in her winter coat, the stuffed reindeer clutched under one arm. My daughter's face lit up when she saw me, then immediately crumpled into confusion. "Why are you back, Mommy?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain in the way that always made my chest ache. "Aren't we going to see the lights?" I knelt down to her level, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "We're going to see even better lights," I promised, improvising quickly. "We're going to stay home and make our own Christmas adventure. We can drive around Charlotte and look at all the decorated houses, and we'll get hot chocolate with extra marshmallows." Emma's disappointment flickered but didn't fully dissipate, her 4-year-old intuition sensing that something was wrong even if she couldn't articulate what. Sarah caught my eye over Emma's head, her expression asking questions she wasn't ready to answer yet. Back at the townhouse, I settled Emma with her favorite animated movie and a snack before retreating to my small home office. The room was barely larger than a closet, with a desk pushed against one wall and filing cabinets occupying most of the remaining space. But it was mine, paid for with money I'd earned, filled with records of investments I'd made and properties I'd acquired while my family dismissed me as financially naive and perpetually struggling. I'd built something substantial in this cramped space, something my father would never have believed possible if anyone had bothered to tell him the details. I sat at my desk and opened the laptop again, but this time instead of reviewing the eviction notices I'd drafted, I found myself scrolling backward through years of documentation. The earliest entries in my records dated back 7 years, to a time when I'd still believed that if I just tried harder, achieved more, or proved my worth more definitively, my family might eventually see me as something other than a disappointment. That belief had been slowly eroded by 1,000 small cuts, each one individually dismissible but collectively devastating. The first document I'd ever saw was from my college graduation. I'd graduated summa cum laude with dual degrees, a feat that had required relentless focus and sacrifice. I'd worked 2 jobs throughout my senior year to cover expenses my father claimed would build character better than his financial support. On graduation day, I'd sent my father a photo of myself in cap and gown, holding my diploma and the academic honor course that marked my achievement. His response, saved in a screenshot I'd taken because even some part of me needed evidence, read simply, "Good. Now maybe you can get a real job and stop asking for handouts." I hadn't asked him for money in 2 years at that point. The text had nothing to do with any actual request and everything to do with his need to characterize my existence as burdensome regardless of evidence to the contrary. But I'd told myself I was just bad at expressing pride, that his generation didn't understand how to offer praise, that he was being too sensitive about his communication style. I'd made excuses for him because the alternative was accepting that my father simply didn't value me the way parents were supposed to value their children. The documentation folder continued with all the emails from my first year working in commercial real estate. I'd been hired by a mid-sized investment firm that specialized in distressed property acquisition and renovation. The work was demanding, requiring long hours and constant learning as I developed skills the university curriculum had only introduced theoretically. I'd been excited about the opportunity and had mentioned it during a family dinner, hoping my father might recognize that he was entering his industry and might even be proud of the connection. Instead, I'd spent 20 minutes explaining why my employer's business model was flawed and why distressed property investment was for people who couldn't compete in legitimate commercial development. I'd concluded by suggesting he should have applied to work for him, where he might have learned proper business practices instead of scavenging around the edges of the real estate market. Monica added that it was probably good I'd found something suitable for my skill level, her tone making clear that suitable meant lesser. Cameron had barely looked up from his phone throughout the conversation, uninterested in my career because it didn't affect him. I'd saved the follow-up email my father sent that night, ostensibly offering advice but actually undermining everything I'd shared about my position. The email laid out all the reasons my employer would likely fall, why I should start looking for other opportunities immediately, and why I'd be willing to hire me at his firm if he demonstrated sufficient commitment and willingness to start at the bottom despite my education. The message was framed as paternal concern but functioned as a systematic dismantling of my achievement and my judgment in accepting the position. That had been the foundation of everything I built subsequently. My employer had been an excellent mentor who taught me how to evaluate properties, structure deals, and identify opportunities others overlooked. Within 3 years I moved from analyst to associate to senior associate, each promotion earned through successful projects and demonstrated competence. My father never acknowledged any of these advances because acknowledging them would have required admitting his assessment had been wrong. The folder contained a subsection labeled financial exploitation that I created 2 years ago when I finally recognized the pattern clearly enough to name it. The first entry documented Cameron's request to borrow $8,000 for what he called a business opportunity that couldn't miss. Ed approached me at a family birthday party, taking me aside with an air of confidential sharing that had flattered me at the time. He explained that he needed bridge financing for a friend's restaurant venture and that he'd repay me within 6 months with interest once the restaurant got established. I'd withdrawn the money from my carefully maintained emergency fund and transferred it to Cameron's account, believing that helping family was what you did when you had resources others needed. Cameron had thanked me effusively, promising this would strengthen our relationship and prove he was a real Harrison after all. The restaurant had closed within 4 months. Cameron had never mentioned repayment, and when I finally asked about it 8 months later, Ed acted bewildered that he expected money back from what he now characterized as my investment in a family member's dream. My father had gotten involved when I pressed the issue, calling me into his office for what he termed a family discussion. Ed explained that siblings support each other without keeping score, that my focus on repayment demonstrated a transactional mindset that was unhealthy in family relationships, and that my commercial real estate work was apparently teaching me to treat relatives like business deals. Ed concluded by suggesting he consider the $8,000 as a gift and learn to be more generous with family. Meanwhile, Cameron had used the money for a vacation to Mexico, posting photos on social media of resort pools and beach excursions while I rebuilt my emergency fund dollar by dollar. The financial exploitation folder contained 4 additional entries. Money borrowed for various emergencies that were later revealed to be discretionary purchases. A request to consign loan that I declined only to be accused of selfishness and lack of family loyalty. Multiple instances where I paid for family dinners or events under pressure, with my father noting each time that he appreciated my contribution but that it would be more impressive if he contributed more consistently. The pattern was clear in retrospect, though I missed it while living through the individual incidents. My family approached me for financial support when convenient, but my actual financial situation was simultaneously characterized as precarious and insufficient to warrant respect. Another section of my documentation focused on exclusion and diminishment. I started noticing the pattern 3 years ago when I been uninvited from Cameron's engagement party. Monica had called to explain that they needed to keep the guest list small and intimate, limited to immediate family and close friends. I felt had but had accepted the explanation until I seen photos posted on social media showing at least 50 guests, including extended family members and business associates I met at previous gatherings. I been specifically excluded, not because space was limited, but because my presence wasn't desired. The exclusions had continued with painful regularity. I been left off the invitation list for my father's 60th birthday celebration, which I only learned about when neighbors had mentioned seeing my car absent from the party they'd driven past. I been told that Christmas Eve dinner was cancelled, only to discover through social media that it had simply been moved to a restaurant and I hadn't been informed of the location change. When I confronted my father about these exclusions, Ed suggested he was being paranoid and that he must have been invited but perhaps hadn't checked my messages carefully enough. The gaslighting had been so consistent that I started doubting my own perceptions until I began documenting each incident with screenshots and saved messages. The most painful documentation involved Emma, my daughter, had been excluded from family events despite being the only grandchild in her age group. Monica had explained that children's birthday parties needed to be kept small, though Cameron's daughter's parties routinely included 20 or more children. Emma had been told there was no room at the Thanksgiving table, though when I declined to attend without her, additional space had suddenly materialized. My father had suggested that bringing Emma to business functions was inappropriate, though Cameron brought his daughter regularly and she was praised for being well-behaved and charming. Ide saved screenshots of social media posts showing family gatherings where Emma's old ABBN included but wasn't. Photos of Cameron's daughter opening Christmas presents from grandparents while Emma received nothing, or received generic gifts that suggested no knowledge of her personality or interests. Images of family vacations to Disney World and beach houses, trips that Emma heard about from Cameron's daughter at rare family events and wondered why she hadn't been invited. Each exclusion had been individually explained with reasonable sounding justifications, but the pattern revealed a systematic preference for Cameron's child over mine that had nothing to do with the children's behavior and everything to do with their parents' positions in the family hierarchy. Ide documented the way my achievements were dismissed while Cameron's mediocre accomplishments were celebrated as extraordinary. When Ide closed my first major property deal, acquiring a small commercial building that Ide renovated and leased to a medical practice, Ide mentioned it at a family dinner. My father had nodded briefly before returning to Cameron to ask about his recent golf game, devoting 15 minutes to discussing Cameron's improved swing while my deal went unremarked upon. Later that same evening, Cameron had announced that he'd been promoted to senior account manager at his marketing firm, and my father had proposed a toast to Cameron's exceptional talent and inevitable continued success. The promotion had come with a modest rise that Cameron had characterized as a major achievement. My property deal had generated more profit in 6 months than Cameron's rise would provide in 2 years, but the financial reality was irrelevant to my family's assessment of relative success. Cameron's achievements within traditional corporate structures validated my father's worldview and thus warranted celebration. My success in independent real estate investment represented a rejection of working for my father and thus received no acknowledgement. Ide sought voice recordings from the past year, audio captured during visits to my father's house when Ide learned that my memory of conversations would later be disputed. The recordings were extensive hours of family interactions that demonstrated patterns I couldn't prove with individual anecdotes. Conversations where my opinions were dismissed or talked over. Interactions where Monica made subtle criticisms of my appearance, my parenting, or my life choices while praising Cameron's wife for identical characteristics. Moments when my father explained basic concepts to me that Ide mastered years ago while assuming Cameron understood complex ideas I clearly didn't grasp. One recording particularly stood out, captured during a Labor Day gathering 4 months earlier. Ide began describing a complex financing structure Ide used to acquire a multi-unit residential property, explaining the creative approach Ide taken to secure funding when traditional mortgages weren't optimal. My father had interrupted halfway through to explain to me how commercial mortgages worked, speaking slowly and using simple language as though he were a child learning basic concepts. When Ide pointed out that he was describing a more sophisticated approach than standard mortgages, Ide patted my shoulder and suggested he focus on mastering fundamentals before attempting advanced strategies he might not fully understand. Cameron had then shared that Ide helped his company's client understand social media marketing, and my father had praised this as exactly the kind of expertise that separated successful professionals from those who relied on luck. The irony was devastating. Ide structured a 6-figure property acquisition using advanced financial instruments, and my father had condescended to me about basics. Cameron had explained Instagram to someone, and my father had celebrated his brilliance. The recording captured the entire interaction, including Monica's agreement that Cameron's talents were being wasted at his current position and her suggestion that my father should create a role for him in the family business where his gifts could flourish. The documentation also included evidence of my family's casual cruelty, moments that might have seemed like misunderstandings or poor communication if taken individually but revealed clear intent when examined collectively. Text messages where Monica had uninvited me from events with increasingly transparent excuses. Emails where my father had criticized my business decisions based on incomplete information and made no effort to verify. Voicemails where Cameron had asked for favors while simultaneously insulting my capabilities or circumstances. One voicemail Ide said that Cameron asking to borrow my car for a weekend because his was being serviced. In the same message, Ede noted that my car was several years old and not as nice as what I was used to driving, but I supposed it would suffice for his purposes since I just needed basic transportation. Ede concluded by suggesting I should consider upgrading to something more appropriate for a professional, as though the money for such an upgrade was simply a matter of priority rather than resource availability. Ide declined to lend him the car, and Ede complained to my father that he was selfish and unwilling to help family members in need. My documentation extended to social media interactions, screenshots of comments where family members had publicly diminished me while praising others. Posts about successful family members that mentioned Cameron repeatedly but never included me despite my achievements being objectively more significant in our shared field of real estate. Photos from family events where he was scrapped out or positioned at the edges while Cameron and his family occupied central positions. Birthday posts wishing Cameron success and celebrating his qualities that were never matched by equivalent posts for me on my birthday. Ide documented the differential treatment of Emma compared to Cameron's daughter with painful ceremonies. Photos showing the elaborate playroom my father had created at his house for Cameron's daughter, complete with custom murals and expensive toys, while Emma was expected to entertain herself with basic books and puzzles when she visited. Screenshots of social media posts celebrating Cameron's daughter's preschool graduation with lengthy captions about her brightness and potential, while Emma's kindergarten graduation had gone unmentioned. Records of Christmas gifts where Cameron's daughter received thoughtful, age-appropriate presents that showed knowledge of her interests, while Emma received generic toys that suggested no relationship or familiarity. As he reviewed years of documentation, a narrative emerged that Ide resisted accepting while living through its creation. My family ante simply failed to appreciate me or struggled with appropriate expression of affection. They had systematically diminished me while elevating Cameron, creating and maintaining a hierarchy where he existed to serve their needs and absorb their criticisms while never receiving reciprocal support or recognition. The pattern was deliberate, consistent, and pervasive across every domain of family interaction. The financial exploitation wasn't careless oversight but intentional extraction. The exclusions weren't space limitations but calculated reminders of my position. The dismissal of my achievements wasn't a poor communication but active denial of evidence that contradicted their preferred narrative. The differential treatment of Emma wasn't unconscious favoritism but purposeful demonstration that my child mattered less because he mattered less. They had built an entire family system around the premise that he was worth less than Cameron, that my needs were less important than theirs, and that my role was to accommodate their preferences regardless of cost to myself. But while they became busy maintaining that hierarchy and enjoying my accommodation of it, I became building something they never noticed because they never bothered to look closely at my life. I created Magnolia Holdings LLC and acquired properties through careful analysis and strategic teaming. I built a portfolio that generated steady income independent of unemployment. I established myself as a respected investor in Charlotte's commercial real estate community, earning referrals and opportunities based on demonstrated competence. I created financial stability for Emma and myself that didn't depend on John's approval or support. And critically, I began documenting everything. Every exclusion, every insult, every exploitation, every broken promise, every casual cruelty. Not because I consciously planned to use it against them, but because some part of me had recognized that I needed evidence. Evidence that I wasn't imagining the mistreatment or being overly sensitive. Evidence that the patterns were real and persistent. Evidence that it doesn't matter if the situation ever required proof that my responses weren't disproportionate reactions to minor slights but appropriate reactions to systematic abuse. That morning at the airport, my father had finally pushed hard enough to trigger the response I'd been unconsciously preparing for during years of careful documentation and strategic financial planning. I'd believed he was teaching me a lesson about respecting family authority and maintaining my proper place in the family hierarchy. Instead, I'd freed me from any remaining obligation to protect him from the consequences of underestimating me. I closed the laptop and sat in my small office while Emma's movie played in the other room and December sunlight slanted through the window.
Tomorrow I would send the eviction notices. The day after, my father would receive them and would likely contact me in anger, confusion, or some mixture of both. Within a week, he would understand that his loser daughter owned the beach house where he'd hosted business associates and family gatherings, the commercial building where one of his satellite offices operated, and the storage facility where he kept equipment and records. He would learn that every lease he'd signed, every check he'd written, every insurance document he'd reviewed had my signature on it as managing member of the LLC he'd never thought to research. He would discover that I'd been his landlord for 3 years, while he'd been teaching me about how real estate actually worked. He would realize that his dismissal of my capabilities had blinded him to the reality of my achievements until those achievements became weapons he'd handed me himself. But before any of that happened, I needed to make peace with what I was about to do. I wasn't acting from revenge, though there was satisfaction in the justice of using his own actions against him. I wasn't trying to hurt him, though the consequences would undoubtedly cause him distress. I was establishing boundaries that should have existed all along, protecting myself and Emma from further exploitation, and demonstrating that there are costs to treating people as worthless while simultaneously depending on them. My father had taught me about power through his abuse of it. He'd shown me how leverage worked by using it against me constantly. He demonstrated the importance of documentation by lying about conversations and denying patterns until I'd learned to preserve evidence. And he'd proven the value of strategic patience by dismissing my restraint as weakness right up until the moment that restraint ended and strategy began. I'd been the underestimated daughter, the dismissed investor, the excluded family member, the target of casual cruelty that was always later characterized as misunderstanding or oversensitivity. But I'd also been learning, building, documenting, and preparing. Now it was time to show my family what their loser daughter had accomplished while they weren't paying attention. The lesson was about to begin, and unlike my father, I would ensure this lesson actually taught what needed learning. The following morning arrived with the particular clarity that comes after a night of minimal sleep and maximum contemplation. I'd stayed awake long past Emma's bedtime, alternating between reviewing documentation and staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, processing the reality that I was about to fundamentally alter my relationship with my family. The decision itself felt solid, grounded in years of evidence and the undeniable cruelty of yesterday's airport incident. But the emotional weight of that decision pressed against my chest like a physical force, making breath feel deliberate rather than automatic. Emma woke early, as 4-year-olds do, padding into my room with her reindeer tucked under one arm and her hair creating a dark halo of tangles around her face. "Mommy, can we still see Christmas lights today?" she asked, climbing onto the bed with the complete trust that children have before the world teaches them wariness. Her question carried no resentment about yesterday's canceled trip, no accusation about broken promises. Just hope that the day might still contain magic despite the previous disappointment. I pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, and feeling the solid warmth of her small body against mine. "Yes," I promised. "Tonight we'll drive around and look at all the decorated houses, and we'll get hot chocolate with so many marshmallows they're practically spilling out of the cup." Emma giggled, the sound like bells, and my resolve hardened into something unbreakable. Whatever consequences came from my actions, they were worth it if they meant creating a life where Emma never learned to accept the kind of treatment I'd endured. After breakfast, I settled Emma with her coloring books and building blocks, ensuring she was happily occupied before returning to my office. The eviction notices I drafted yesterday waited in my email drafts folder, each one reviewed multiple times for legal accuracy and appropriate tone. I read through them once more, checking that every claim was substantiated by documentation, that every deadline met legal requirements, that every word reflected professional boundaries rather than personal vendetta. The beach house notice cited unauthorized structural modifications that violated the lease agreement, specifically the deck expansion my father had commissioned last summer, without requesting permission or providing required engineering documentation. The commercial building notice referenced the pattern of late rent payments that had accrued fees totaling over $3,000 across the past 18 months. Fees my father had apparently never noticed or questioned when his accountant paid them. The storage facility notice was simpler, invoking the month-to-month clause and providing the required 30-day notice of non-renewal, without the need to cite specific violations. My finger hovered over the send button for a long moment. This action would be irreversible, not because the notices themselves couldn't be withdrawn, but because once my family understood what I'd done, the foundation of our relationship would be permanently altered. There would be no returning to the previous dynamic where I absorbed their treatment and hoped for change. This was a threshold, and crossing it meant accepting that some relationships can only improve by ending or fundamentally transforming. I pressed send on all 3 emails simultaneously, watching them disappear from my drafts folder, and enter the digital pathway that would deliver them to my father's business email, his personal email, and his accountant's office within seconds. The action felt anticlimactic, just a simple click that contained the weight of years of accumulated hurt, and the force of boundaries finally being established. I sat back in my chair, waiting to feel something dramatic. Instead, I felt only a quiet certainty that I'd done what needed doing. My phone rang within 20 minutes, a number I didn't recognize with a Charlotte area code. I considered letting it go to voicemail but answered instead, curious about who might be calling so early on a Saturday morning. "Hello, this is Jessica," I said, keeping my tone professionally neutral. "Jessica Harrison?" The voice was female, older, with a warm quality that immediately differentiated it from the tension I'd been carrying since yesterday. "This is Margaret Shen. I'm your father's accountant. I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but I just received some notices that I need to clarify with you before I bring them to Richard's attention." My pulse quickened slightly, though I kept my voice steady. "Of course. What can I help clarify?" There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling, and then Margaret spoke with careful precision. "These notices indicate that Magnolia Holdings LLC is terminating lease agreements on 3 properties that your father's company currently occupies. The notices are signed by you as managing member. I need to confirm whether these documents are legitimate before I alarm Richard unnecessarily." "They're legitimate," I confirmed. "Magnolia Holdings is my company, and those properties are owned through that entity. Your client has been leasing from me for the past 3 years. The leases are being terminated for the reasons stated in each notice. All deadlines comply with the lease terms and applicable state law." Another pause, longer this time. "Jessica, I've been Richard's accountant for 15 years. I handle all of his property-related transactions. I had no idea you owned these properties. The lease agreements came through routine channels, and we never investigated the LLC ownership structure, because everything appeared professionally managed. Does your father know you own Magnolia Holdings?" "No," I said simply. "He never asked, and I never volunteered the information. I established the company specifically to keep my business interests separate from family dynamics." Margaret's exhale was audible through the phone. "Well, those dynamics are about to become very complicated very quickly. These properties represent significant operational infrastructure for your father. The beach house alone hosts probably a dozen business functions annually. May I ask what prompted this action?" I could have said it was just business, could have hidden behind professional language and refused to explain personal motivations to my father's accountant. But something in Margaret's tone suggested genuine concern rather than mere professional obligation, and I found myself wanting to explain to at least one person who might convey the context to my father if he was capable of hearing it. Yesterday morning, my father accessed my travel account through an old credit card authorization and canceled my Christmas vacation. Then he sent text messages calling me a loser and telling me to find my own way home from the airport. This was after years of systematic exclusion, financial exploitation, and treatment that made clear I'm valued only for what I can provide and criticized for everything else. These notices aren't revenge. They're boundaries being established with someone who's proven he won't respect them voluntarily. Margaret was silent for so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally she spoke, her voice softer than before. "I'm going to tell you something I probably shouldn't as his accountant, but as someone who has 3 daughters of my own I think you should know. Your father has never mentioned you in any business context I've been part of over 15 years. He talks extensively about Cameron, about Cameron's potential, about planning for Cameron's future involvement in the business. But you might as well not exist in his professional world." The words landed with surprising force despite confirming what I'd already known. Hearing it stated so baldly by a neutral party removed any remaining possibility that I'd misunderstood or been oversensitive to my father's attitude. "Thank you for telling me that," I said quietly. "It helps to have external confirmation that I'm not imagining the dynamic." "You're not imagining it," Margaret said firmly. "And for what it's worth, I think establishing boundaries with someone who treats you that way is healthy rather than vindictive. But I need to prepare you for what's coming. When Richard understands what these notices mean, particularly when he realizes you've been his landlord for 3 years without him knowing, his response is going to be intense. He doesn't handle surprises well, and he especially doesn't handle situations where he's been operating from incomplete information, while others have been better informed. I appreciate the warning, I said, but I'm prepared for his reaction. I've been documenting his behavior for years, and I have recordings of conversations that make clear this action is proportional to a pattern of mistreatment, not an overreaction to a single incident. Margaret made a small sound that might have been approval or concern. You've been planning this, she observed. Not consciously, I admitted, but I've been protecting myself by keeping records, and those records happen to justify actions I never thought I'd need to take until yesterday. Margaret and I spoke for another 10 minutes, discussing the logistics of the notice delivery and the timeline for my father's required response. She agreed to personally deliver the notices to him this afternoon, giving him the weekend to process the information before Monday's business operations required his attention. She also offered to serve as a neutral intermediary if communication between my father and me became necessary, but direct contact proved too contentious. I accepted her offer, grateful to have someone who understood both the business implications and the personal context. After ending the call with Margaret, I sat in my office feeling oddly unsettled despite the conversation having gone better than I'd anticipated. I'd expected my father's accountant to be defensive of his interests or dismissive of my concerns. Instead, I'd found someone who validated my perceptions and offered practical support for navigating what came next. The unexpected ally reminded me that not everyone in my father's orbit shared his blindness to his own behavior. Emma appeared in the doorway of my office, dragging her reindeer and wearing a serious expression that looked comically adult on her small face. "Mommy, are you sad?" she asked with the directness that children employ before they learn to pretend not to notice emotional distress. "I'm not sad, baby," I assured her, which was true enough. "I'm just thinking about grown-up things that are complicated but important." She climbed into my lap without invitation, settling against my chest with the complete confidence that she was welcome there always. Her small hand patted my arm in a gesture I recognized as one I used to comfort her after nightmares or disappointments. "It's okay, Mommy," she said with the gravity of someone dispensing profound wisdom. "Sometimes grown-up things are hard, but then we have hot chocolate and they're better." I laughed despite the weight I'd been carrying, holding her close and marveling at how this small person I'd created had somehow developed depths of compassion I was still learning to access myself. "You're absolutely right," I told her. "Hot chocolate makes most things better. How about we go get some right now, even though it's morning, and then we'll figure out what adventure we want to have today." Emma's face lit up with delight at this breaking of normal rules, and within 15 minutes we were dressed and heading to a local coffee shop that served excellent hot chocolate alongside their espresso drinks. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of December day that made Charlotte feel almost like the winter wonderland Emma imagined from storybooks, despite temperatures that would never support actual snow. The coffee shop was busy with Saturday morning customers, people reading newspapers or working on laptops or chatting with friends over steaming mugs. I ordered Emma's hot chocolate with extra marshmallows as promised, and got myself a coffee I desperately needed after minimal sleep. We settled at a small table near the window, Emma swinging her legs and watching the marshmallows slowly dissolve into white swirls on the chocolate surface. While Emma was absorbed in her drink, a woman approached our table with a tentative smile. I recognized her vaguely from somewhere, though I couldn't immediately place the context. "Excuse me," she said, her voice apologetic for the interruption. "I'm sorry to bother you, but aren't you Jessica Harrison? I heard you speak at the Women in Real Estate Investment Seminar last spring, and your presentation on creative financing for small-scale investors was incredibly helpful for my first property purchase." The recognition sparked my memory. The seminar had been one of the few professional events I'd allowed myself to participate in, accepting an invitation to present despite my father's suggestion that I wasn't experienced enough to be teaching others. I'd spoken about the strategies I'd used to build my initial portfolio, focusing on approaches accessible to investors without substantial capital or family money to leverage. "Thank you," I said, genuinely pleased. "I'm glad the information was useful. Did your purchase work out well?" The woman's smile broadened. Better than I'd hoped. I used the lease option strategy you described to acquire a small duplex, and I've already refinanced to pull out equity for my next property. Your presentation gave me confidence that I could enter real estate investment without a huge starting fund or family connections in the industry. She paused, then added with slight embarrassment, I actually didn't realize you were Richard Harrison's daughter until someone mentioned it after the seminar. Your approaches seem so different from his that I wouldn't have connected you. I felt Emma looking up at me, sensing something significant in the conversation, even if she didn't understand the specifics. We are different, I agreed, keeping my tone light. I found my own path in the industry rather than following his model. The woman nodded enthusiastically. Your path is helping a lot of people who couldn't access the traditional model. Several of us from that seminar have stayed in touch and are implementing strategies you taught us. You're making a real difference for women investors who don't have the advantages of established family businesses or massive capital to start with. After she left, returning to her own table with a final thanks, I sat quietly with my coffee while Emma resumed her marshmallow investigation. The encounter had been brief but had shifted something in my perspective. While my family had been busy dismissing my achievements and characterizing my work as insignificant, I'd apparently been building a reputation among people who valued the knowledge I'd gained and the strategies I'd developed. My father's assessment of my worth wasn't the only possible measurement, wasn't even an accurate measurement, was in fact completely divorced from the reality of what I'd accomplished and how those accomplishments affected others. Emma finished her hot chocolate with a satisfied sigh, leaving a marshmallow mustache on her upper lip that I gently wiped away with a napkin. What do you want to do now, sweetheart? I asked, ready to let her direct our day toward whatever simple joy she desired. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Can we go to the park? She asked. And swing really high. And then tonight we see the Christmas lights? We can absolutely do all of those things, I confirmed, and her resulting smile felt like absolution for every difficult decision I'd made in the past 24 hours. This was what mattered, I reminded myself. Not my father's approval or my family's inclusion. Not revenge or vindication or even justice, though those might come as secondary benefits. What mattered was building a life where Emma grew up knowing her worth was inherent, rather than contingent. Where she never learned to accept mistreatment as the price of belonging. Where she saw her mother establish and maintain boundaries that protected both of them. We spent the afternoon at the park, pushing the simple swing set to heights that made Emma squeal with delighted terror, while I held tight to the chains and reminded her I'd never let her fall. Other families populated the playground, parents watching children climb and slide and run with the particular alertness that comes with supervising small humans in spaces designed for controlled risk. I wondered how many of those families were navigating difficult relationships with their own parents. How many were carrying stories of exclusion or exploitation or dismissal that they'd never spoken aloud because families weren't supposed to work that way. My phone buzzed in my pocket multiple times during the afternoon, but I ignored it. Whatever messages were arriving could wait until Emma had experienced a day unmarred by adult complications. She deserved my full attention. Deserved hours where I wasn't distracted by the weight of family conflict, or the anticipation of consequences soon to unfold. We played until the December sun began its early descent and Emma's energy finally flagged from hours of enthusiastic activity. Back at the townhouse, I checked my phone while Emma watched another movie and recovered from the park's exertions. 3 missed calls from an unknown number, 2 voicemails and a text message from Margaret asking me to call her when I had a moment. I returned her call from my office, closing the door to keep the conversation private from Emma's peripherally attentive ears. Margaret answered on the first ring. Jessica, thank you for calling back. I delivered the notices to your father about 2 hours ago. I thought you should know that his initial reaction was exactly as I predicted. Intense doesn't quite capture it. He's demanding to know how you acquired the properties, whether the transactions were legal, and whether he has grounds to challenge the notices. I assured him everything appeared properly documented and legally sound, but he's not accepting that assessment easily. I'd expected this, had anticipated that my father's first response would be denial and attempts to find technical flaws that would invalidate my position. What did you tell him? I asked, curious about how Margaret had framed the situation. I told him that Magnolia Holdings is legitimately owned by you, that the properties were acquired through normal commercial transactions over the past 3 years, and that the leases he signed are legally binding documents regardless of whether he researched the LLC ownership. I also told him that the violations cited in each notice are factually accurate based on his own records. Margaret paused before continuing. Jessica, he's planning to contact you directly. Tonight probably. He's convinced that if he can just talk to you, he can resolve this as a misunderstanding or negotiate a solution that allows him to keep the properties. I want you to be prepared for that conversation if you choose to answer when he calls. He's not approaching this from a place of understanding or apology. He's approaching it as a business problem that needs solving, and he doesn't yet recognize that this isn't really about business. I appreciate the warning, I said. And I appreciate you being willing to serve as intermediary if needed. But I think I need to have at least one direct conversation with him so he understands that I'm serious about the boundaries being established and that this isn't negotiable. Margaret agreed that direct communication was probably necessary eventually, though she cautioned me to have my documentation readily available and to consider recording the conversation if legal in North Carolina. I assured her I was well aware of the state's single-party consent recording law and had been documenting conversations for years. After ending the call with Margaret, I sat in my office considering how the evening's conversation with my father might unfold. He would likely begin with anger, demanding explanations and characterizing my actions as betrayal or vindictiveness. When anger didn't produce the desired capitulation, he'd probably shift to negotiation, offering compromises that maintained most of his access to the properties while making minimal concessions to my concerns. If negotiation failed, he might attempt emotional manipulation, invoking family loyalty or suggesting I was damaging relationships beyond repair. And finally, if all else failed, he'd likely threaten legal action or other consequences designed to make me regret establishing boundaries. But I'd been preparing for exactly this progression through years of experiencing his patterns and learning to predict his tactics. I knew that my leverage was strong because everything I'd done was legal, documented, and justified by his own behavior. I knew that his threats would be largely empty because exposing the situation publicly would require him to admit he'd been paying rent to his daughter for 3 years without realizing it. And I knew that his attempts at emotional manipulation would fail because I'd already accepted that our relationship was fundamentally broken, and that maintaining it would cost more than ending it. Emma called from the living room, announcing that her movie was finished and asking if it was time yet to see the Christmas lights. I checked the time and realized that darkness had fallen while I'd been processing the day's developments, making it perfect timing for our planned light tour. I bundled Emma into her coat and strapped her into her car seat, then programmed a route through several Charlotte neighborhoods known for elaborate Christmas displays. As we drove through streets transformed by colored lights and illuminated decorations, Emma provided running commentary on every display. "Look, Mommy, that one has a whole Santa workshop. Oh, that one has a snow globe you can see inside. Mommy, can we get that mini lights for our house?" Her joy was uncomplicated and pure, untainted by knowledge of the family conflict that had necessitated this substitute for our canceled Asheville trip. This was what I was protecting, I reminded myself. This capacity for wonder and happiness that didn't depend on anyone's approval or inclusion. My phone rang while we were stopped at a red light, the number displaying as my father's cell. Emma was absorbed in examining a house decorated to look like a gingerbread creation, giving me a moment to decide whether to answer. I let it ring through to voicemail, choosing to finish Emma's light tour before engaging with the conversation I knew was inevitable. The phone rang twice more during our drive, and I ignored both calls, focusing instead on Emma's delight and the simple peace of spending time with someone who loved me without conditions or qualifications. Back at home, after Emma was bathed and read to and tucked into bed with her reindeer and a kiss goodnight, I finally listened to my father's voicemails. The first was clipped and angry, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Jessica, call me immediately. We need to discuss these ridiculous notices your accountant delivered. I don't know what you think you're playing at, but this ends now." The second voicemail was longer and more controlled, his tone shifting toward the reasonable authority he used in business negotiations. "Jessica, I've reviewed the situation more carefully. There's obviously been some misunderstanding about these properties. Call me so we can sort this out like adults and resolve whatever issue you think needs addressing." The third voicemail had been left just minutes ago, while I'd been tucking Emma in. His voice carried a quality I'd rarely heard before. Something that might have been uncertainty or might have been tactical adjustment of approach. Jessica, your mother, and I need to speak with you about this situation. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock at the house. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. We're still your family, regardless of whatever's upset you. I deleted all 3 voicemails without responding, then typed a single text message to my father. I'll come to the house tomorrow at 10. Bring whoever you want. But understand that I'm not negotiating the notices. I'm explaining them. There's a difference. I hit send before I could second-guess the message, then turned off my phone completely to prevent any immediate response from disturbing the quiet I'd created in my small townhouse. That night I slept better than I had since the airport incident, despite knowing that tomorrow would bring the confrontation I'd been unconsciously preparing for during years of documentation and boundary building. I slept well because I'd chosen myself and my daughter over my family's comfort. Because I'd established consequences for behavior that should never have been acceptable. Because I'd stopped hoping my family would change, and had instead changed my response to their unchanging nature. And because for the first time in my life, I was approaching my family not as the daughter hoping for approval, but as the woman who'd built something substantial while they weren't paying attention. Tomorrow they would learn exactly what their loser daughter had accomplished. And I would learn whether they were capable of growth or whether the relationships I'd grieved losing were already gone long before I'd taken the actions that made that loss official. Sunday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. The kind of morning where you wake knowing the day holds a threshold you cannot avoid crossing. I rose before dawn despite having slept soundly, my body responding to the upcoming confrontation with heightened alertness that made rest impossible once consciousness returned. The townhouse was quiet around me. Emma still sleeping peacefully in her room with her reindeer clutched close, unaware that today her mother would face the family that had spent years trying to diminish her. I made coffee in the pre-dawn darkness, standing at my kitchen window and watching the neighborhood slowly illuminate as other early risers turned on lights and began their Sunday routines. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal against the backdrop of what I was preparing to do. Other people were planning church services or lazy breakfast preparations or weekend errands, while I was mentally reviewing years of documentation and preparing to confront my father with evidence of his systematic mistreatment. Sarah had agreed to watch Emma for the morning, sensing from my carefully neutral request that something significant was happening even though I hadn't provided details. She'd simply nodded when I'd asked yesterday evening, telling me to take whatever time I needed, and that Emma was always welcome at her house. That kind of uncomplicated support, offered without demands for explanation or judgment about my choices, reminded me what healthy relationships actually looked like. Sarah valued me without requiring me to earn that value through performance or accommodation. I showered and dressed with deliberate care, choosing clothing that struck a balance between professional credibility and personal comfort. Dark jeans, a structured blazer over a simple silk blouse, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a style that kept it controlled without looking severe. I wanted to present myself as the competent professional I'd become rather than the diminished daughter they expected. Someone whose appearance communicated capability and self-possession, rather than defensiveness or aggression. Before leaving, I organized my evidence into multiple formats for easy access during what would certainly be a contentious conversation. My laptop contained the complete documentation folders, organized chronologically and by category. My tablet held copies of the most crucial documents, the property records and lease agreements and photographic evidence of violations. My phone had the audio recordings queued and ready to play, each one labeled with date and brief description of content. And in my bag I carried printed copies of the eviction notices, the LLC formation documents, and selected examples of the most damaging text messages and emails. Emma woke as I was preparing to leave, appearing in the kitchen doorway with sleep-tousled hair and her reindeer dragging behind her. "Where are you going, Mommy?" she asked, her voice still soft with the remnants of dreams. I knelt down to her level, smoothing her hair and meeting her eyes with the honesty I tried to always offer her. "I have to go talk to some grown-ups about important things," I explained. "You're going to spend the morning with Miss Sarah, and when I come back we'll do something fun together. Just us." Emma studied my face with the perceptiveness that children develop when they learn to read their parents' emotional states for clues about their own safety. "Are you scared?" she asked directly, and I considered how to answer truthfully without burdening her with adult anxieties. I'm a little nervous, I admit it, because sometimes important conversations feel big and serious. But I'm also brave. And I'm doing something that needs to be done to make our lives better. Emma nodded as though this explanation made perfect sense, then hugged me fiercely around the neck. "You're the bravest, Mommy," she declared with absolute conviction, and I held her close, drawing strength from her uncomplicated faith in me. After dropping Emma at Sarah's house with promises to return by early afternoon, I drove toward my father's home in Myers Park, one of Charlotte's most prestigious neighborhoods. The route was familiar from years of obligatory visits, each tree-lined street triggering memories of arrivals filled with dread and departures filled with relief that another performance was complete. But this morning felt different because I was approaching not as the supplicant daughter hoping for scraps of approval, but as a property owner prepared to enforce legitimate boundaries regardless of familial objection. My father's house rose imposingly behind manicured landscaping and ornate iron gates that he'd installed 5 years ago, as a symbol of his arrived status. The 6,000-square-foot colonial revival represented everything he valued: visible success and exclusivity, and the kind of architectural grandeur that announced wealth to everyone who passed. I'd spent portions of my childhood in this house after my mother's death, back when it was simply large rather than ostentatiously oversized, before Monica had insisted on the addition that made space for Cameron's elaborate home gym and media room. I parked in the circular driveway behind Cameron's luxury SUV and Monica's imported sedan, noting with dark amusement that they'd assembled the full family tribunal for this conversation. My father had clearly briefed them on the situation and recruited them as reinforcements, expecting that unified family pressure would convince me to back down from my position. The strategy might have worked on the version of me who desperately wanted their acceptance and would have sacrificed nearly anything to achieve it. But that version had died somewhere between the airport and the coffee shop where I drafted eviction notices. I gathered my materials and walked to the front door, which opened before I could ring the bell. Monica stood in the entryway wearing the expression of barely controlled irritation that I recognized as her default attitude toward my existence. She dressed for the occasion in what she probably considered appropriately serious clothing, a cashmere sweater set that had certainly cost more than my entire outfit. "Jessica," she said without preamble or greeting. "They're waiting in Richard's office. Try not to make this more dramatic than it needs to be." The comment was so perfectly characteristic that I almost smiled. Even now, even in a situation where I held all the leverage and they were responding to my actions, Monica was positioning me as the source of unnecessary drama, rather than as someone responding appropriately to documented mistreatment. "Good morning, Monica," I replied with deliberate courtesy that I knew would irritate her more than matching her hostility. "I appreciate you making time this morning." I walked past her toward my father's home office, a space I'd been inside perhaps a dozen times during my entire life despite living in this house for years. The office was his sanctuary, the place where serious business occurred, and my presence there had always been tolerated briefly rather than welcomed genuinely. The door stood open, revealing my father behind his massive desk and Cameron occupying one of the leather chairs positioned for visitors. They both looked up as I entered, their expressions containing mixtures of anger, confusion, and something that might have been wariness. My father gestured toward the empty chair beside Cameron with the air of someone granting permission to be seated in his presence. "Sit down, Jessica. We need to discuss this situation you've created." I remained standing, setting my bag on the chair he'd indicated but not taking the subordinate position he'd assigned me. I'd spent too many years sitting in chairs while he stood behind his desk, the physical positioning reinforcing the power dynamic that characterized all our interactions. This conversation would happen on different terms. "Actually," I said calmly, "I'll stand. This won't take long. And I'm more comfortable on my feet for important conversations." My father's eyes narrowed at this small defiance, this refusal to follow the script he'd written for the meeting. Monica entered behind me and positioned herself near the doorway, arms crossed in a posture that suggested she was prepared to witness my chastisement and probably looking forward to it. "Let's be clear about what's happening here," my father began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used with employees or subordinates who displeased him. "You've sent notices claiming I need to vacate properties that you somehow acquired without anyone's knowledge. I don't know what game you think you're playing or who's advised you that this is appropriate behavior, but it ends now. These properties are essential to my business operations, and your little tantrum isn't going to disrupt that. It's not a tantrum, I responded evenly, opening my tablet and pulling up the property records. It's enforcement of legitimate lease agreements that you signed without bothering to investigate who owned the properties you were renting. I own Magnolia Holdings LLC, which owns the beach house in Wilmington, the commercial building on Providence Road, and the storage facility on Eastway Drive. You've been my tenant for 3 years, and you're now being notified that your leases are being terminated for violations that are documented and legally sufficient. Cameron leaned forward, his expression suggesting he thought he'd identified a fatal flaw in my position. You can't just claim to own properties and expect us to believe it without proof. Anyone can create fake documents. I handed him the tablet without comment, the screen displaying the first property record with my name clearly listed as the registered agent for Magnolia Holdings, and the deed showing the LLC as owner. He stared at the document, his certainty wavering as he recognized the official county seal and recording information that couldn't be easily falsified. My father stood and came around his desk, holding out his hand for the tablet. Cameron passed it to him silently, and I watched my father's face as he scrolled through property records, lease agreements, and operating documents that proved everything I'd claimed. His expression shifted from anger to confusion to something that resembled shock as the reality penetrated his assumptions. These can't be legitimate, he said finally, though his tone carried less conviction than his words. When did you acquire these properties? How did you get the capital? Who helped you structure these deals? I acquired the first property 4 years ago using proceeds from my work in distressed property investment, I explained, keeping my voice factual rather than emotional. I established Magnolia Holdings 3.5 years ago through a business attorney who helped me structure the LLC properly. I purchased the beach house 3 years ago when the previous owner was facing foreclosure and needed a fast cash buyer. I bought the commercial building 2 years ago through a short sale that your broker colleagues apparently didn't think was worth pursuing. And I acquired the storage facility 18 months ago from an estate sale where the heirs wanted quick liquidation. The information clearly unsettled him because it demonstrated both capability and opportunity that he'd never imagined I possessed. But how did you finance these purchases? He demanded, as though identifying the funding source would somehow invalidate the transactions. You don't have that kind of capital. You're constantly struggling with that townhouse mortgage and raising Emma alone. Where did the money come from? The question revealed so much about how he perceived me, how he'd constructed a narrative about my financial circumstances that bore no resemblance to reality. I haven't struggled with my mortgage since the first year I owned the townhouse, I corrected him. I've had stable income from property investments and my consulting work for the past several years. You assumed I was struggling because I drive an older car and don't spend money on status symbols you value. But I've been building wealth systematically while you weren't paying attention because you never thought my financial life was worth investigating. Monica spoke from her position near the door, her voice sharp with accusation. You've been deceiving us, hiding these assets and pretending to be something you're not. That's fraud, Jessica. You can't trick family members into business relationships under false pretenses. I turned to face her directly, making sure she could see that her attempt at intimidation was having no effect whatsoever. I didn't deceive anyone, I said clearly. I established a legitimate business entity and acquired properties through standard commercial transactions. The fact that you never asked about my business interests or investigated the ownership of properties you were leasing isn't deception on my part. It's negligence on yours. Cameron joined the attack, his tone suggesting he thought he'd found moral high ground to claim. This is what happens when you give women business responsibilities they're not equipped to handle. They get vindictive and emotional and use whatever leverage they stumble into as weapons against family. Dad, you need to contact your attorney and figure out how to invalidate these documents and get her removed from any position where she can damage the family business. The casual misogyny was so characteristic that I didn't bother addressing it directly. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened the folder containing audio recordings. Before we continue with accusations and threats, I said calmly, I think you should hear something. I recorded this 3 days ago when I dropped off Emma's Christmas gift. The baby monitor in my bag captured a conversation you had after you thought I'd left. I pressed play, and my father's voice filled the office. Did you cancel her flight? Monica's voice responded affirmatively. This morning. She needs to learn that planning trips without checking with family isn't acceptable. Let her figure out her own transportation. Maybe she'll develop some gratitude for the access we've given her. The recording continued with Cameron's contribution and Monica's dismissive characterization of my financial situation, their laughter clearly audible as they discussed their enjoyment of teaching me a lesson. The silence after I stopped the recording was absolute. My father's face had drained of color, Monica's arms had uncrossed and dropped to her sides, and Cameron was staring at his phone as though he could find escape in its screen. You recorded us, my father said finally, his voice lacking the authority he'd carried moments before. Without our knowledge or consent. That's illegal wiretapping. North Carolina is a single-party consent state for recording conversations, I informed him. Only one party to a conversation needs to consent to recording it, and I was present in your house during this conversation. The recording is completely legal and admissible as evidence of your intentions and attitudes. You canceled my Christmas vacation, stole money from my account through an unauthorized refund, and sent text messages calling me a loser and telling me to find my own way home. Then you laughed about it and characterized it as teaching me a lesson I needed to learn. I pulled out my phone again and began playing additional recordings, each one demonstrating some aspect of the pattern I'd been documenting for years. Conversations where my achievements were dismissed, while Cameron's mediocre accomplishments were celebrated. Discussions about keeping family gatherings small that were followed by large parties I wasn't invited to. Debates about whether to include Emma in family events where Monica argued that one grandchild was enough to accommodate, and my father agreed that Cameron's daughter should be prioritized. Their own voices, captured across multiple occasions, created an irrefutable record of systematic exclusion and devaluation. My father sat down heavily in his chair, the recordings clearly affecting him in ways my previous explanations never had. When confronted with their own words, played back in their own voices, the usual tactics of denying, reframing, or claiming misunderstanding became impossible. Jessica, he began, his tone shifting towards something that might have been intended as conciliatory. You're taking things out of context. Those comments weren't meant the way they sound in isolation. I stopped the recording I'd been playing and met his eyes directly. Dad, I have 3 years of recordings. Hours of conversations that establish a consistent pattern, not isolated comments taken out of context. I have text messages and emails that span 5 years showing the same attitudes and behaviors. I have financial records proving that Cameron borrowed $8,000 he never repaid, and that you characterized my request for repayment as inappropriate scorekeeping. I have photographs of family events where Emma was excluded while Cameron's daughter was celebrated. And I have documentation proving that you accessed my travel account without authorization and canceled a trip I'd paid for with my own money. I opened my laptop and turned it to face them, displaying the folder structure that organized years of evidence. Every category was labeled clearly: financial exploitation, exclusion and dismissal, differential treatment of grandchildren, unauthorized access to accounts, verbal abuse and insults. Each folder contained dated files with descriptions that made the content immediately clear. This isn't me being oversensitive or misunderstanding occasional awkward comments, I continued. This is systematic mistreatment that you've maintained consistently across multiple years and multiple contexts. Monica had moved closer during the evidence presentation, and her expression suggested she was beginning to understand the scope of what I'd compiled. You've been planning this, she accused. Building some kind of case against us like we're criminals instead of family. Her tone suggested this was self-evidently outrageous, rather than a reasonable response to their behavior. I've been protecting myself, I corrected. I've been documenting concerning patterns because I learned that you would later deny conversations happened or claim I'd misunderstood situations that were actually quite clear. I kept records because I couldn't trust my own memory against your revisions of what was said and done. And those records happen to prove that the boundaries I'm establishing now are proportional responses to documented harm, rather than overreactions to minor incidents. Cameron stood abruptly, his agitation manifesting in physical movement. This is insane, he declared. You're trying to destroy the family because you're jealous that I've always been more successful and more valued. You're using some properties you somehow acquired to punish Dad for not treating you like you're as important as I am. It's petty and vindictive and proves exactly why you've never deserved the same consideration I get." His statement was so revealing, so perfectly encapsulating the family dynamic, that I almost thanked him for articulating it so clearly. "Cameron," I said calmly, "I'm not jealous of you. I'm not trying to destroy the family. I'm establishing consequences for behavior that should never have been acceptable in the first place. You've been valued more than me not because you achieved more or contributed more, but because you were Monica's biological son and I was the daughter who reminded Dad of the wife he lost. That differential treatment wasn't based on merit. It was based on preference that had nothing to do with who we actually were or what we actually accomplished." I pulled out printed copies of my professional credentials, documentation of properties I'd acquired, records of my investment performance, and testimonials from the Women's Real Estate Investment Seminar where I'd been asked to speak. "While you were being celebrated for getting promoted to senior account manager at your marketing firm," I said, laying out the documents on my father's desk, "I was acquiring my fourth investment property and renovating it for a 30% return on investment. While you were being praised for helping clients understand social media, I was being invited to teach other women how to enter commercial real estate without family money or connections. Our actual achievements don't match the family narrative about our relative worth." My father stared at the documents I'd spread across his desk, seeing perhaps for the first time actual evidence of what I'd built while he'd been dismissing my work as insignificant. "Where did all this come from?" he asked quietly, and I couldn't tell if the question referred to my accomplishments or to my willingness to confront him with them. "When did you become this person who does things without family input or approval?" "I became this person when I realized that waiting for family approval meant waiting forever," I answered. "I became this person when I understood that your version of love required me to stay small and grateful and subordinate to Cameron regardless of actual merit. I became this person when I recognized that protecting Emma from this dynamic mattered more than maintaining relationships that were harming both of us. You taught me that power matters more than fairness, and that documentation matters more than verbal agreements. I learned the lessons you were teaching, even if they weren't the lessons you thought you were teaching." Monica had been scrolling through my tablet during this exchange, examining the property records and financial documentation. "Richard," she said carefully, drawing his attention away from the paper spread before him, "this is all legitimate. She actually owns these properties and we've actually been paying her rent for 3 years. The leases are properly executed, the violations she's citing are documented, and the notices appear to be legally sufficient." The confirmation from Monica seemed to penetrate my father's resistance more effectively than anything I'd said. He looked at me as though seeing me clearly for the first time, or perhaps seeing me accurately for the first time, and I held his gaze without flinching or apologizing. I'd been his tenant, his daughter, his financial resource, and his punching bag for my entire adult life, accepting whatever treatment he offered while hoping that someday he'd recognize my worth. But the airport incident had shattered any remaining hope that recognition would come voluntarily. If he was going to understand my value, it would be because I forced that understanding through consequences he couldn't ignore. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice stripped of the authority and certainty he'd carried into the conversation. "What's going to make this go away and let us return to normal family relationships?" The question revealed that he still didn't understand what was happening, still believed this was a negotiation where sufficient concessions would restore the previous status quo. "I don't want anything except for the leases to be honored or terminated as specified in the notices," I answered. "This isn't negotiable, Dad. I'm not trying to extract something from you in exchange for backing down. I'm establishing boundaries that protect me and Emma from further mistreatment. Whether our relationship continues in any form depends on whether you're capable of respecting those boundaries and treating us with basic dignity. But the properties aren't leverage for negotiation. They're simply no longer available to you after the notice periods expire." The finality in my tone seemed to register with all three of them simultaneously. I wasn't bluffing, wasn't posturing, wasn't using this situation as a ploy to gain advantage in family dynamics. I was genuinely prepared to follow through with the evictions regardless of their responses or the relationship consequences. That realization settled over the room like a physical weight, changing the atmosphere from confrontation to something more like reckoning. I gathered my materials and prepared to leave, having said what needed saying and shown what needed showing. The conversation could continue or not. They could accept reality or continue resisting it, but my part was complete. I'd presented the evidence, explained my position, and made clear that the boundaries I'd established would remain in place regardless of their preferences. What they chose to do with that information was their decision, but it would no longer be my responsibility to manage their emotional responses or to make accommodation easier than accountability. As I reached the office door, my father's voice stopped me one final time. "Jessica, wait. We need to talk about how to fix this. How to make things right between us." I turned back to face him, seeing perhaps the first genuine uncertainty I'd ever witnessed in his expression. "Dad," I said gently, "you can't fix years of systematic mistreatment with a single conversation or a promise to do better. You've shown me consistently who you are and what I mean to you. I've finally accepted that reality and stopped hoping you'll become someone different. If you actually want to change, if you genuinely want to understand what you've done and why it matters, that work is yours to do. But it doesn't change the property situations, and it doesn't erase the documentation that proves why these boundaries became necessary." I left the office and walked back through the house I'd once lived in, past the family photos that documented Cameron's childhood while barely including mine, past the rooms where I'd learned to make myself invisible to avoid criticism, past the dining room where I'd sat at countless uncomfortable family dinners hoping this time might be different. At the front door, I paused and looked back one final time at the life I was walking away from, acknowledging both what I was losing and what I was gaining in the exchange. Then I stepped out into the December sunshine and drove back toward my townhouse, toward Emma and Sarah and the chosen family that valued me without requiring me to earn that value through performance or diminishment. The confrontation was complete, and whatever came next would unfold according to choices my father and his family made about whether they were capable of growth or whether the relationships were already irretrievably broken beneath the surface maintenance we'd been performing for years. The drive back to my townhouse passed in a blur of Charlotte neighborhoods decorated for holidays that suddenly felt distant from my immediate reality. My hands gripped the steering wheel with more force than necessary, residual tension from the confrontation manifesting in physical tightness across my shoulders and neck. The meeting had unfolded largely as I'd anticipated, with my family cycling through predictable responses of denial, anger, and attempted negotiation. Yet seeing their faces as they listened to recordings of their own voices, watching comprehension dawn that I'd been documenting their behavior for years, had affected me in ways I hadn't fully prepared for. I'd expected to feel triumphant or vindicated when I finally confronted them with irrefutable evidence of their systematic mistreatment. Instead, I felt hollowed out, as though the confrontation had required me to excavate parts of myself I'd kept carefully buried beneath layers of accommodation and hope. The daughter who desperately wanted her father's approval, who'd believed that sufficient achievement might earn his respect, who told herself that family relationships were worth preserving despite their cost, that daughter had to be acknowledged and mourned before I could fully commit to the path I'd chosen. Sarah's house appeared ahead. A modest ranch home with cheerful decorations and a wreath on the front door that embodied the kind of warmth my father's house had never contained despite its architectural grandeur. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, allowing myself to feel the full weight of what I'd done before putting on the composed face that Emma needed to see. My daughter deserved a mother who was present and steady, not distracted by the emotional aftermath of family confrontation. Whatever processing I needed to do would happen later, in the private hours after Emma slept and I could safely fall apart without audience or consequence. Sarah opened the door before I could knock, Emma visible behind her holding a drawing she'd created during the morning. Sarah's eyes searched my face with the concern of someone who cared about my well-being, but respected my boundaries enough not to demand explanations I wasn't ready to provide. "How did it go?" she asked simply, the question containing volumes of unspoken support. "About as expected," I answered, keeping my voice neutral. "Difficult but necessary. Thank you for watching Emma this morning. It helped enormously to know she was somewhere safe and happy, while I dealt with complicated family matters." Sarah nodded, squeezing my arm briefly in a gesture of solidarity. "Anytime," she said. "You know that. Emma's been great, and she made you a picture of your adventure yesterday. She's been excited to show you all morning." Emma rushed forward with her drawing, a child's rendering of the two of us looking at Christmas lights with exaggerated decorations covering every available space on the paper. "Look, Mommy," she announced proudly. "It's us seeing all the pretty lights." And look, I made the marshmallows in your hot chocolate really big because you said they were the best part. Her enthusiasm pulled me out of the dark space the morning had created, reminding me why I'd taken actions that felt painful in the short term, but were necessary for long-term well-being. I knelt down and studied the drawing with the seriousness it deserved, pointing out details and praising her artistic choices. "This is beautiful, sweetheart," I told her honestly. "We should hang it on the refrigerator when we get home, so we can see it every day and remember our special adventure." Emma beamed with satisfaction, and I gathered her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and feeling her solid warmth against me. This was what mattered, I reminded myself. Not my father's approval or my family's inclusion, but this small person who loved me unconditionally and whose well-being depended on my ability to create healthy boundaries. Back at the townhouse, I settled Emma with lunch and afternoon activities while I retreated to my office under the pretext of handling some business matters. In reality, I needed time to process the morning's events and to think carefully about the implications of what I'd set in motion. The confrontation was complete, the evidence presented, the boundaries established. But the actual enforcement of those boundaries would unfold over the coming weeks, and I needed to ensure I was prepared for whatever responses my family chose to employ. I opened my laptop and began creating a detailed timeline of expected events and required actions. The eviction notices provided 60 days for the beach house and commercial building, 30 days for the month-to-month storage facility. My father would likely attempt multiple strategies during those periods, and I needed to anticipate and prepare for each potential approach. Legal challenges to the eviction notices, though unlikely to succeed given my thorough documentation. Attempts to negotiate extensions or modifications to the lease terms. Emotional appeals through family members or mutual acquaintances. Public relations efforts to portray me as vindictive or unstable. Each possibility required consideration and advanced preparation to ensure my boundaries remained intact despite pressure. I drafted response templates for various scenarios, creating standardized language I could deploy quickly without needing to compose careful replies in the moment. For legal challenges, I had Margaret's contact information and the business attorney who'd helped establish Magnolia Holdings. Both had already reviewed my documentation and confirmed the legal soundness of my position. For negotiation attempts, I prepared clear statements that the lease terminations were final and that no extensions would be granted regardless of circumstances offered as justification. For emotional appeals, I scripted responses that acknowledged the difficulty of the situation, while maintaining firm boundaries about what would and would not change. The public relations concern required more careful consideration. My father moved in social and business circles where reputation mattered significantly, and he would likely craft narratives that portrayed him sympathetically while casting me as an ungrateful or emotionally unstable daughter. I couldn't control what stories he told or how others interpreted our situation, but I could ensure that anyone who asked me directly would hear a factual account supported by documentation. I prepared a brief, professional explanation that focused on business relationship termination due to lease violations rather than emphasizing family dynamics, allowing the documentation to speak for itself if questions arose. As I worked through these practical preparations, I found myself confronting deeper questions about my motivations and intentions. Was I establishing legitimate boundaries to protect myself and Emma from further harm? Or was I using my unexpected leverage to punish my family for years of mistreatment? The distinction mattered, not because punishment would be undeserved, but because I needed to ensure my actions aligned with my values, rather than simply mirroring the behavior I'd found unacceptable in them. I opened a new document and began writing, not for any external audience but for my own clarity. At the top of the page I typed a single question. Why am I doing this? The answer needed to be something I could return to when doubt crept in, when family members accused me of cruelty, when well-meaning acquaintances suggested I was overreacting or damaging relationships that could be salvaged with sufficient effort. I wrote steadily for 20 minutes, allowing thoughts to flow without censoring or organizing them prematurely. The words that emerged were raw and honest, capturing both the hurt of years of mistreatment and the determination to create something different for Emma and myself. When I finished, I read through what I'd written, recognizing themes that needed to be articulated more clearly. I am doing this because I matter, I wrote, creating a clear statement that could anchor me when everything else felt uncertain. I am doing this because Emma deserves to grow up seeing her mother valued and respected, rather than systematically diminished. I am doing this because boundaries without consequences are merely suggestions that will be ignored by people who benefit from violating them. I am doing this because love that requires me to accept mistreatment is not actually love, and preserving relationships that damage me serves no one's genuine well-being. The articulation helped, creating solid ground beneath decisions that had felt overwhelming in their implications. But I also needed to examine what I was not doing, to distinguish my actions from the behavior patterns I'd found so destructive in my family. I created a second list, this one focused on limits I was placing on my own responses despite my justified anger. I am not doing this to cause maximum pain or to take revenge for past hurts, I wrote. I am not trying to destroy my father's business, or to create financial hardship beyond the natural consequences of lease terminations. I am not sharing their private information publicly or attempting to damage their reputations in their social circles. I am not using Emma as a weapon or threatening to cut off their access to her contingent on their compliance with my demands. I am not demanding apologies or expressions of remorse as conditions for the boundaries I am establishing. The distinction was crucial because it separated proportional response from vindictive retaliation. My actions were defensive rather than offensive, protective rather than punitive. I was removing myself and my resources from relationships that had proven harmful, not actively working to harm the people who'd mistreated me. The difference might seem subtle to outside observers, but it was fundamental to maintaining my own integrity throughout a process that could easily devolve into a cycle of escalating cruelty. I considered the specific harms I'd endured, and whether my responses were proportional to those harms. The financial exploitation, where Cameron had borrowed money he never repaid, and where I'd been pressured to fund family events while my contributions were simultaneously dismissed as insufficient. The property terminations would cost my father money and inconvenience, but they were legitimate business decisions based on documented lease violations. The consequence fit the pattern of behavior that had created it. The systematic exclusion, where I'd been uninvited from family events or told gatherings were canceled when they were simply relocated without informing me. The boundary I was establishing was self-exclusion, removing myself from a family system that had consistently communicated I was unwelcome, except when my presence served their purposes. I was simply accepting their demonstrated preference, and making it permanent rather than continuing to hope each new invitation might signal changed attitudes. The dismissal of my achievements and the differential treatment compared to Cameron, where my objectively significant accomplishments were ignored, while his mediocre achievements were celebrated extravagantly. The consequence was that my father was learning about my actual capabilities through their impact on his life rather than through the conversations where he dismissed my work as insignificant. I wasn't trying to prove my worth to him anymore. I was simply allowing reality to reveal itself without my continued protection of his illusions. The mistreatment of Emma, where my daughter was excluded from family events, received inadequate gifts that showed no knowledge of her personality, and was treated as less valuable than Cameron's daughter despite being equally deserving of grandparental affection. The consequence was that I was protecting Emma from further exposure to dynamics that would teach her to accept devaluation as normal. I wasn't demanding they treat her better. I was removing her from situations where differential treatment communicated harmful messages about her worth. Each harm had a proportional response that focused on protection, rather than punishment. I wasn't trying to make my family suffer equivalently to how they'd made me suffer. I was establishing conditions where they could no longer continue patterns that had proven resistant to all other forms of address. The boundaries I was enforcing would cause them difficulty and discomfort, but those consequences flowed naturally from their own choices rather than from my desire to cause them pain. I also needed to examine my responsibility in the dynamics that had persisted for so long. While my family bore primary responsibility for their treatment of me, I recognized that my accommodation of that treatment had enabled its continuation. Each time I'd accepted an exclusion without protest, each time I'd allowed dismissive comments to pass without correction, each time I'd provided financial support without establishing clear repayment terms, I'd communicated that these behaviors were acceptable. My silence had been misinterpreted as consent rather than as the survival strategy it actually was. This recognition didn't shift blame from them to me, but it did acknowledge that changing the dynamic required me to change my responses. I couldn't control whether they chose to treat me with respect and dignity, but I could control whether I continued making myself available to be mistreated. The power I'd lacked when I was younger and financially dependent had been gradually accumulating as I built my career and resources. The question was whether I would use that power to continue accommodating their preferences or to finally protect my own well-being. I thought about the various alternatives I might have pursued instead of the property terminations. I could have simply increased my distance from the family without taking any active steps that would affect their lives. But distance alone hadn't protected me, as demonstrated by my father's willingness to access my travel account and cancel my vacation despite months of minimal contact. I could have attempted another conversation about their behavior patterns and their impact on me. But years of such conversations had produced only temporary adjustments followed by returns to established patterns, suggesting that dialogue without consequences was insufficient. I could have continued documenting their behavior while maintaining surface relationships, building my case until some future moment when action became unavoidable. But that approach would have required Emma to continue being exposed to exclusion and differential treatment, while I gathered additional evidence. The airport incident had made clear that waiting for the perfect moment meant allowing harm to continue indefinitely. I could have sought mediation or family therapy, involving neutral professionals who might help everyone communicate more effectively. But mediation assumes both parties are willing to examine their behavior and make genuine changes, and nothing in my family's responses suggested that willingness existed. Each alternative had been considered and rejected as insufficient given the demonstrated patterns and the need to protect Emma from continued exposure. The property terminations were not my first choice or my preferred approach. They were the option that remained after all less confrontational approaches had failed to produce meaningful change. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for others is to stop pretending that unacceptable situations are tolerable and to establish consequences that make continued harm impossible. I also considered whether I was prepared for the possibility that these actions would permanently end my relationships with my father, Monica, and Cameron. The answer required honest examination of what those relationships actually provided compared to what they cost. My father had never been a source of emotional support, practical assistance, or genuine interest in my life beyond surface pleasantries. Our relationship consisted primarily of my attempts to earn approval that never materialized and his criticism of choices he'd never bothered to understand. Losing that relationship meant losing the hope that it might someday become something better, but it didn't mean losing something that had ever actually existed. Monica had been hostile to me from the moment she'd entered our family, viewing me as competition for resources and attention rather than as a child who'd lost her mother and needed care. Our relationship had always been characterized by her barely concealed contempt and my careful avoidance of situations that might trigger her criticism. Losing that relationship meant no longer walking on eggshells around someone who'd never wanted me in her life anyway. The loss was more about releasing the fantasy of a maternal figure than about losing an actual source of support. Cameron had been the favored sibling whose success required my diminishment to fully shine in our father's eyes. Our relationship consisted of his demands for my resources and his dismissal of my achievements, with no reciprocal support or genuine interest in my well-being. Losing that relationship meant no longer funding his projects or absorbing his casual cruelty, while pretending we had sibling bonds that transcended our competitive positioning. Whatever connection we might have had as children had been destroyed by family dynamics that pitted us against each other, rather than fostering genuine sibling affection. When I examined what I was actually losing if these relationships ended, I recognized that most of what I'd miss were fantasies rather than realities. The father who valued and respected me, the stepmother who offered maternal warmth, the brother who supported rather than competed with me. These people had never existed except in my hopes for what family relationships should be. I was grieving the loss of potential relationships rather than mourning the end of what had actually been present. But I also needed to acknowledge the genuine losses that accompanied even toxic relationship endings. I was losing the biological connection to my father, the person who'd created me, and who represented my link to my mother's memory. I was losing the extended family system that included cousins and relatives who might be casualties of the primary relationship ruptures. I was losing the societal validation that comes from being part of an intact family structure, accepting the questions and judgments that accompany family estrangement. These losses were real, and would need to be processed even as I maintained certainty that the boundaries themselves were necessary. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.